I am Jordan Queen. I'm one of the UTI subject matter experts here at NHSN, and I'm joined by my colleagues Marissa McMean and Denise Leaptrot. They'll be assisting in the chat and the Q&A. Before we get started, let's see some fun emojis in the chat. Show some excitement about UTI here. All right. Looking good. Looking like everybody's got some energy. I know we're getting close to lunchtime and I'm the only thing in between you and that lunch, so I will do my best to keep things going. Before we get started, I have a couple of important bits of information about the training. We talked about this a little bit earlier today, but this webinar is intended to provide guidance to patient safety users of NHSN. Members of the media are asked to disconnect from the live session now and contact the CDC Media Office at media@cdc.gov with any questions. And for those looking for continuing education credits, we have a hyperlink here in the slide deck, and that may be added to the chat as well. I'll lean towards my healthcare educator colleagues there. This is a listen-only session, so you'll not be able to unmute or show your camera for questions. However, the first 1,000 participants can access the chat and Q&A features. The chat is designed for more tech support related to the meeting itself, but please, and knowledge checks as well. But the Q&A is designated for questions related to the actual presentation topic, so use the Q&A for questions related to UTI. There won't be any specific case reviews today, and any unanswered questions can be submitted to ServiceNow via the hyperlink here, or it will be included in the chat as well. Participants with SAMS access will have access to the annual training community to submit questions that way as well. But don't fret, if you don't have SAMS access, we're still checking our inbox, so feel free to send us questions to nhsn@cdc.gov. But please use subject line 2025 annual training so it's easy to pick those out. And now we'll go ahead and get started with the UTI training. All right, so during this training, we will demonstrate how to perform UTI surveillance. And by the end of this lesson, you will be able to define NHSN UTI criteria, perform interactive knowledge checks, understand how to report a UTI event and denominator data, and you'll wrap it all up with the ability to assess and apply UTI criteria to UTI case studies. I wanted to center our conversation here a little bit around the current CAUTI burden. For those of you who are not familiar, NHSN puts out progress reports, and the most current version is from 2023. In 2023, the CAUTI standardized infection ratio, or SIR, was 0.62 across general acute care hospitals. When comparing the 2015 national baseline to 2023, we saw a decrease of that SIR by 38%. This progress certainly reflects commitment to improving patient safety. However, in 2023, over 17,000 CAUTIs were reported amongst general acute care hospitals. This is a significant number, and it reminds us that we need to remain vigilant in our efforts to further reduce infections. As all of you know, each CAUTI represents a patient who may experience complications, extended hospital stays, and increased healthcare costs. Recent literature highlights that the average incremental cost of a healthcare-associated CAUTI is almost $10,000, with some variation between ICU and non-ICU locations. I've included a link to this journal article if you wish to check it out after the presentation today. I found it pretty interesting and think you all will as well. Before you get started with UTI surveillance, it's important to know what materials are relevant and where to find them. So you can see here the screenshot is a photo of our UTI webpage on the NHSN homepage. And some of the relevant materials that you're going to want to take a look at to be successful when operating within this module is Chapter 2. Marissa McMean, my UTI colleague, but she also did an independent training earlier in this session focused on Chapter 2 key concepts, looking at timeframes like the infection window period and secondary BSI attribution period. So please ensure you have that on hand. Chapter 7 is specific to UTI events. Chapter 16 includes key terms that are common across all protocols. And I should have put in a gold star here on bullet number 4, the UTI FAQ. This is super important. clarification, sticking points on certain things. We put a lot of work into covering those in the FAQ, so please use those just as often as you use chapters 2, chapter 7, and 16. We also offer some on-demand UTI trainings. You can click the link highlighted here by the red arrow. And we also offer an HAI checklist as you go through making your UTI event determinations. And again, I've included a hyperlink here. So for those who have the slide deck open, you can go ahead and click that and you'll see what I have shared here on the screen. As I mentioned, there was a dedicated Chapter 2 training earlier in this session, so we're going to just do a quick flyby here and point out some specific things that pertain to the UTI events module, hoping to spend about 5-ish minutes here, but we'll see if I can keep it within that time frame. The first up is the infection window period, also known as the IWP. For any of you who have reached out to me via ServiceNow, you know that I love to use the abbreviation. So hopefully we can decode some of those things if you aren't already familiar. But the IWP is a 7-day time frame during which all site-specific infection criteria must be met. It includes the collection date of the first positive diagnostic test, the 3 days before, and the 3 days after. And I think the biggest takeaway here is our important note at the bottom. An eligible urine culture will always set the IWP for this module. In the example to the right, you can see that we have an eligible urine culture. I don't have a pathogen listed, but let's say it's eligible for use, and it meets that proper colony forming unit threshold. It makes the center of the 7-day IWP, spanning the 3 days before and the 3 days after. Next up on our list of reminders is the date of event. The UTI date of event is the date the first element used to meet UTI criterion occurs for the first time within the 7-day IWP. But what does that really mean, and what could that first element be? So when working in this module, that first element could be a positive urine culture or an NHSN UTI sign or symptom. And some folks can find this to be a little confusing, as previously I just noted that the urine culture always sets the infection window period. That's independent of the date of event. So let's kind of forget about that for now. In the example to the right, you can see that there's an eligible urine culture with the proper CFU threshold and organism. And that is the first element that occurs within the 7-day IWP. It was collected on 4/28, and that sets the date of event. However, you may be asking, well, if fever was reported on 4/29, how does that come into play? So in another example here, you can see that if that fever was actually reported before the urine culture within the 7-day IWP, the date of event will shift from 4/28 to 4/27. So I just want to add some clarity there. The next time frame we'll talk about is the repeat infection time frame, or the RIT. It's a 14-day time frame where there are no UTI events that can be reported. This includes SUDI and ABUDI events. The UTI date of event is going to be day 1 of this 14-day time frame. All UTI events identified set in RIT, and again, this includes non-catheter associated events and present on admission events. And if any additional urine cultures identified within the RIT timeframe contain an eligible organism that differs from that original culture, they can actually kind of be scooped up and added to the original event. And an important note here as well, any new UTI events captured within the RIT does not change the initial device association determination or location of attribution. So if within the 10 days, or within maybe say day 10 of the 14-day time frame, a new identity is identified, but maybe it's no longer catheter associated, that does not change the fact that the original event was a CODI. And if a patient moves to a different unit around that time, the original location of attribution remains the same. So nothing changes there. You just are able to kind of scoop up that new event and grab any new eligible organisms and kind of move on. Lastly, I'll talk to the secondary BSI attribution period, or SBAP. This is a period in which blood specimens must be collected for a secondary BSI to be attributed to a UTI event. A UTI event is always deemed primary, and all UTI events set an SBAP, similar to an RIT. And again, this includes non-catheter associated events and present on admission events. You can see in the diagram here, the SBAP is comprised of both the IWP and the RIT, and it can vary in length from 14 to 17 days. The location of attribution is the inpatient location where the patient was assigned on the date of event. And as a reminder, non-bedded inpatient locations, for example, the operating room or nuclear medicine, are not eligible for attribution of HAI events. And a patient must be assigned to an inpatient location where denominator data are collected, which includes patient days and device days. The only exclusion to location of attribution is the transfer rule. And if you find that a UTI date of event is the date of transfer or discharge, or that next calendar day, UTI surveillance does extend to that next calendar day, the UTI is attributed to the transferring or discharging location or facility. And if you find that a patient is in multiple locations during this time frame, you would attribute the UTI to the first location where the patient was housed the date before the UTI date of event. So that was a quick flyby of the Chapter 2 reminders that are relevant for this UTI events module. We're now going to start digging into UTI-specific content. I'm going to give everybody a minute here before we jump on to the next section. Yeah, and if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to drop those in the chat, or sorry, the Q&A, and Marissa or Denise will go ahead and get those addressed. But as mentioned before, urine culture is extremely important when conducting UTI surveillance, and you may be curious what makes a urine culture eligible for use. So that's what we're going to talk about here for the next few slides. In order for a urine culture to be eligible for use, it must be greater than or equal to 100,000 colony-forming units, or CFU per ml, of at least one eligible organism, and can have no more than 2 species of organisms present. You'll see an asterisk here. It's highlighting the NHSN terminology browser. That should be utilized to assess UTI organism eligibility. I've included a hyperlink here for ease of use, and my colleague Denise Leaptrot conducted an independent training earlier in this session as well, specifically focused on use of that NHSN terminology browser. I highly recommend taking a tour of the browser if you haven't already, and reviewing the materials that were provided for that particular training. Another important note here is that a positive urine culture alone is not a UTI event, which means that you cannot set an RIT or an SBAP just if you have an eligible positive urine culture. You must meet either SUDI or a Booty criterion to apply either of those timeframes. We do receive questions related to this, and so I just wanted to drive home the point that, again, a positive urine culture alone does not equate to UTI event when conducting UTI surveillance. Let's talk about urine specimens a little bit here. As a reminder, urine collected from any source, including urine collection devices such as nephrostomy tubes, can be used when making a UTI event determination. We highlight this in UTI FAQ question 20, and you'll see notes to the FAQ fairly often, as I do want to reiterate the importance of using that as you conduct surveillance. And so I've included them here as a hyperlink so you can take a tour that way, or you can just do a quick Google search looking for NHSN UTI FAQs. We do have a few excluded organisms from this events module, which include any yeast or yeast species, which does include Candida auris, mold, dimorphic fungi, or parasites. However, these excluded organisms can be present in a culture with an eligible bacterium, and it does not disqualify that urine culture from use. But if one of these organisms alone is in a urine culture, it is not eligible for use. So let's look through a couple of examples here. We have 100,000 CFU per ml of E. coli and Candida albicans. This is eligible for use, as E. coli is an eligible organism, and that CFU threshold is met. And again, the presence of Candida albicans does not disqualify this urine culture from use. It would just not be reported to the NHSN application. However, an ineligible urine culture could look like the following: greater than or equal to 100,000 CFU per ml of E. coli and Klebsiella pneumoniae. However, yeast was also present. And while yeast's presence alone does not disqualify this culture from use, it does make this culture have greater than 2 species of organisms identified, and in turn is ineligible for use. Often we receive some questions about colony count ranges. I know some laboratories can report them a little bit differently than others, And occasionally we see ranges such as 50,000 to 100,000 CFU or 75,000 to 100,000. And unfortunately, these do not meet UTI criteria. However, if you visit UTI question 2, it does go into a little bit greater detail, but historically, some laboratories have been able to confirm exactly where in that range a pathogen falls. And if they are able to clarify that and publish it in the final patient medical record, it can be then eligible for use. Some examples below include 100,000 CFU per ml of Staphylococcus aureus and 75 to 100,000 CFU per ml of Klebsiella aerogenes. Unfortunately, the laboratorian was not able to clarify where Klebsiella fell within this CFU range, and it is not eligible for use and does not get reported in the NHSN application. However, it remains an eligible urine culture as Staphylococcus aureus is an eligible organism and meets that proper CFU threshold. An ineligible urine culture could look like something below, 50,000 to 100,000 CFU per ml of E. coli. And again, the laboratorian was not able to clarify where within that range E. coli falls, and it makes this culture ineligible for use as there was no other, bacterium present that could have been at the proper CFU threshold. Another exclusion is going to be mixed flora. Mixed flora in the final lab report is indicative or implies that there are greater than 2 organisms present, which does not meet NHSN UTI criteria. So if, for example, you have Acinetobacter baumannii meeting that proper CFU threshold and 10,000 CFU of mixed flora, unfortunately, that culture is ineligible for use, even though Acinetobacter is an eligible organism and does meet that CFU threshold. This is greater than 2 species of organisms identified in the culture, and it cannot be used. If you want additional information related to mixed flora, you can visit FAQ question 3. As for morphology, differing morphology does not affect organism count. So in the example below, we have E. coli number 1, E. coli number 2, and those are considered one organism, and you can actually combine those CFU counts, which make this eligible for use as it is greater than 100,000 CFU per ml. And in this culture, you also have Staphylococcus aureus, which is an eligible organism and meets that CFU threshold. And that is a wrap up of urine cultures. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about devices, specifically indwelling urinary catheters or IUCs. And NHSN defines an IUC as a drainage tube that is inserted into the urinary bladder through the urethra, is left in place, and is connected to a drainage bag, which does include leg bags. IUCs are also often called Foley catheters, so we may use that language interchangeably. IUCs can be used for intermittent or continuous irrigation, both of which are included in CODI surveillance. And this does include Coude catheters. And for those of you who are not familiar, Coude catheters have a curved tip designed to navigate obstacles in the urethra, which may be a better fit for some patients. I will also note that this module aims to look at risk related to device use in general. It's not necessarily tracking each individual catheter. The following devices do not qualify as an IUC: suprapubic catheter, nephrostomy tubes, urostomy, ileoconduit, or perineal urethrostomy. However, if these devices are present in addition to an IUC, the eligibility of the IUC is unaffected. So, for example, a patient with an IUC and a suprapubic catheter are eligible for inclusion in CODI surveillance. As a reminder, urine collected from any source, including the above sites, can be used when making UTI event determination, and I have UTI FAQ question 20 listed there if you want to review this a little bit later. When looking to count catheter days, the date of insertion is catheter day 1, and if an IUC is removed and reinserted, you should follow the next guidance here. So if after IUC removal, the patient is without an IUC for at least 1 full calendar day, then the IUC day count will start anew. And I really want to emphasize that this is not to be read as 24 hours. We're strictly looking at calendar days here. If instead a new IUC is inserted before a full calendar day has passed, the IUC device day count will continue uninterrupted. And some important notes here, catheters present at admission are not excluded from surveillance. And if that IUC is present at the time of admission, the date of admission is equivalent to catheter day 1. And an IUC that is present for any part of a calendar day counts as a device day. So for example, if a patient has an IUC in place for, say, 8 hours out of the 24-hour day, it still counts as a device day, and that calendar day should be counted. Let's look at some examples here. I'll give you, 20 seconds here to review both patients A, patient B, and their device utilization. I'm going to take a sip of water here. All right, so let's talk about these patients. Patient A, you can see that they had an IUC in place on 3/29, which is IUC day 1, going all the way to 4/2, which is IUC day 5. However, that IUC was removed, but a new one was reinserted the following day. Their device day count continues uninterrupted. However, for patient B, you can see day 1 is the same as patient A, 3/29, and also on 4/2, they had their device removed. However, the device was not replaced with the new IUC on 4/3, which is a full calendar day passing without a device, and you can see that the device day count restarts for that particular patient with day 1 on 4/4. Congratulations, we reached our first knowledge check, and it is related to catheter day counts. So let's hope that some of what we just went through stuck. In the scenario below, removing an IUC and inserting a new one will reset the catheter day count. Let me know in the chat if you think that is true or false, and then we'll discuss.
And a lot of false responses.
Okay, that is great news. Everyone gets an A+ or a gold star, whatever your preference. The correct answer is false. The device day count will continue uninterrupted, given that a full calendar day has not passed where the patient was without an IUC. So again, nice work. Don't forget how we count catheter days by the time we get to the case studies. Jot this down if you need to. So far we've covered Chapter 2 key concept reminders. We've done a deep dive into Chapter 7. And next up, we're going to talk about NHSN UTI definitions, talking about SUDIs and ABUDIs, which happen to be the two specific types of UTIs that are captured within the surveillance module. Again, I love the abbreviations, so let me go ahead and spell things out for y'all. A SUDI is a symptomatic urinary tract infection, and an ABUDI is an asymptomatic bacteremic urinary tract infection. We're going to go through the different criterion that are present in Chapter 7. If you have any questions, again, related to these things, please submit a question to the Q&A or the AT community. So we're going to start with SUDI 1A. That is a catheter-associated urinary tract infection, or a CAUTI, and this criteria is applicable to patients of any age, and they must meet criterions 1, 2, and 3 below. So first off, the patient had to have had an indwelling urinary catheter that had been in place for more than 2 consecutive days in an inpatient location on the date of event, and, don't forget the and, was either present for any portion of the calendar day on the date of event or was removed the day before the date of event. And it's important to look at the date of event here when looking to attribute a device when working within this module, as it is centered around whatever you find to be the date of event. Criterion 2, the patient has at least one of the following signs or symptoms. That's going to be fever, suprapubic tenderness, costovertebral angle pain or tenderness, often referred to as CVA pain or tenderness, urinary urgency, urinary frequency, and dysuria. And you'll notice there's some annotations following some of these, so let's talk about it. An asterisk is indicative of no other recognized cause, so suprapubic tenderness and CVA pain are eligible for use, provided they have no other recognized cause, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. And those symptoms marked with kind of a caret there, these symptoms cannot be used when a catheter is in place, as a catheter can actually cause report of them. And last but not least, certainly not least, the patient has a urine culture with no more than 2 species of organisms identified, at least one of which is a bacterium that is greater than or equal to, again, that CFU threshold. And I have a big box here at the bottom. You're going to hear me say it for each criterion, but all elements of UTI criterion must occur within that IWP that is set by the eligible urine culture. All right, so we reached another knowledge check. Take a moment to review the details below and let me know if you think this is a CODI/SUDI 1A event.
Nothing in the chat just yet.
Okay, we'll give them another 10 seconds. You.
All righty, I'm seeing a mix, yes and no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about it. So this is a CODI. It was an eligible urine culture that sets an infection window period of 11/9 to 11/15. There was an eligible sign or symptom captured within that 7-day IWP, which was suprapubic tenderness, and the patient had an IUC in place for greater than 2 days on the date of event. And I forgot to note this earlier, but you may see 3 horizontal blue bars related to some of my knowledge checks and case studies, and I put those there just to indicate that there's a break in the timeline. So just be aware of that moving forward so that you can keep up with the timeframes. But nice work there. I hope that cleared things up a little bit. We're going to move on here to SUDI B, which is a non-catheter associated urinary tract infection, or a non-CODI. Similarly to SUDI 1A, this is for patients of any age, and they must meet 1, 2, and 3 below. So one of the following must be true. The patient has or had an indwelling urinary catheter, but it has or had not been in place for more than 2 consecutive days in an inpatient location on the date of event, or the patient did not have an indwelling urinary catheter in place on the date of event, nor the days before the event. So they just did not have a catheter at all. 2 is going to mirror SUDI 1A, so I'm not going to walk through all of the symptoms as they are the same. And 3 is also the same to SUDI 1A. So the patient, again, must have a urine culture that is eligible for use, which means that there's no more than 2 species of organisms identified, and at least one of which must be a bacterium that meets that proper CFU threshold. And again, all of these elements must occur within the 7-day IWP. We have another knowledge check here for y'all. Let me know if you think this is a SUDI 1B event.
All right, answers are coming in. Again, it's a split.
Okay, we got a mixed group here today. Let's talk about it. So the answer is yes. Again, there's an eligible urine culture, which sets an IWP of 1024 to 1030. And there is also an eligible sign or symptom within that 7-day IWP. And it's a fever that is greater than 38 degrees Celsius or 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. And the patient had an IUC that was in place for less than 2 days on the date of event, which makes this a SUDI 1B event. Next up in our queue of criterion is SUDI 2, and this can be a CODI or a non-CODI, and it is focused on patients that are 1 year of age or less. Again, they must meet the age threshold and 1, 2, and 3 below. So 1, patient is less than or equal to 1 year of age, and they can be with or without an indwelling urinary catheter. The patient has at least one of the following signs or symptoms, which I will review with you here since they're a little different than SUDI 1A and 1B. We have fever, hypothermia, apnea, bradycardia, lethargy, vomiting, and suprapubic tenderness. And you'll note that those with a caret have no other, are eligible for use if they have no other recognized cause. And third is the urine culture eligibility, which is related to no more than 2 species of organisms identified and meeting that CFU threshold. You'll probably be tired of me saying this, but again, all of these elements must occur within the IWP in order to have a SUDI 2 event. And you're probably noticing a pattern here. After each criterion, we are going to have a knowledge check. Moving on to our third one here for SUDI 2 criterion. Let me know what you think about this situation and if it is or is not a SUDI 2 event.
Lots of yes.
Oh, okay, exciting. We're on track.
Yes.
Nice. Great work,
Thanks, everyone.
Yes, thanks so much. So the correct answer is yes. This patient was less than 1 year old. They had an eligible urine culture, which sets an IWP of 1.5 to 1.11. And there was an eligible sign or symptom within that 7-day IWP, and that's the fever as well as lethargy there reported on 1/7. And I'll also note that this is a non-CODI SUDI2 as the patient had no IUC present. But in the future, when monitoring for SUDI2 events, again, they can be catheter associated or non-catheter associated. The last criterion we're going to talk about today is the asymptomatic bacteremic urinary tract infection, or a BUTI. This criterion is for patients of any age, and they must meet 1, 2, and 3 below. 1, the patient is with or without an indwelling urinary catheter and has no signs or symptoms of SUDI 1 or 2, regardless of age. So that's really important. Keep that in mind for the knowledge check. I'm going to give you a little bit of a hint here. Number 2, the patient has a urine culture with no more than 2 species of organisms identified, at least one of which is a bacterium that meets that CFU threshold, so very similar to all of our SUDI criterion there. And 3, the patient has an organism that's identified from a blood specimen with at least one matching bacterium to the 100,000 CFU bacterium that was identified in the urine culture, or this patient can be eligible to meet LCBI criterion 2, but it must be without a fever and has a matching common commensal in the urine. Again, all of these elements must occur within that IWP. So as you may have guessed, we got one more knowledge check here related to whether or not this is or is not an ABUTI event. Give you some time to review the information, and we'll take a look at the answers in the chat.
Ooh, lots of yes. Few no's sprinkled in. No. And now it's yes. Now it's no. It's a split.
We seem to be a little unsure, and that was on purpose. It is supposed to be a little tricky here, but let's first talk about it. So this is an ABUTI event. There's an eligible urine culture. It sets that IWP, and there is no SUDI sign or symptom within the 7-day IWP. And the organism from the blood culture does match the urine culture organism, which is E. coli. And you may be saying, wait, no SUDI sign or symptom. They reported abdominal pain on 12/6. Well, let's talk about that. So abdominal pain is too general to be interpreted as suprapubic tenderness, as there can be many causes of abdominal pain. So we need a little bit more specific there. So let's move on to the FAQ section. We're going to talk about CVA pain and suprapubic tenderness. I'm going to go out of order here and talk about question 14 first, as that pertains to the trick in our knowledge check that was shown just before. So again, pain that is documented as abdominal pain in the medical record is too general and not to be interpreted as suprapubic tenderness, as there are many causes of general abdominal pain. However, we do accept lower abdominal pain that can be specified as left, right, or bilateral. We also accept bladder or pelvic pain or discomfort to meet suprapubic tenderness. So keep that in mind for the case studies a little bit later. And then jumping back up here to question 13, would NHSN accept low back pain to describe CVA pain? So generalized low back pain in the medical record is not to be interpreted as CVA pain or tenderness, as there can be many causes. So very similar, right? It's a little too general. However, left, right, or bilateral lower back pain or flank pain, which can also have further clarification of whether it's left, right, or bilateral, is acceptable to describe costovertebral pain or CVA pain. Another one of our FAQs, question 14, is actually a two-parter, and it speaks more to with no other recognized cause. So if that's new to folks or you need a little bit of a refresher, it can be used to exclude, symptoms that are differentiated from a UTI symptom. So maybe there's a symptom of interest, but you believe it to be related to another cause. It must be clearly differentiated from that UTI symptom. And ideally, clinical decisions related to exclusions of suprapubic tenderness or costovertebral angle or tenderness should be made by a physician and or their designee within your organization. Truly someone who has access to the patient's entire medical record and clinical picture, so that they have kind of an all-encompassing glance into that patient's kind of history and what they're going through during that current admission. And you'll notice that not all signs or symptoms were reported here, and that's because some of them are not eligible for another recognized cause exclusion. And this includes fever, urinary urgency, urinary frequency, and dysuria. And this is documented in the protocol, but just wanted to reiterate that here today. Also note that this determination should be made at the facility level, and again, must have occurred during that current admission. Okay, so let's recap a little bit here. We have talked about Chapter 2 key concepts, UTI events in Chapter 7 key concepts. We've walked through all of the NHSN UTI definitions, and now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about UTI event reporting. Here on the screen are the data collection forms and instructions. You can find them on our webpage by following the hyperlinks included on this slide. You can see on the upper right is a quick glimpse of the UTI event form, and on the bottom right is the table of instructions, or TOI. I really urge you to take a close look at the TOI, as there's some important instruction for data collection and entry, which will make sure that you're most successful as you go through the NHSN application to report a UTI event. This is a glimpse of what it looks like in the NHSN application, and in order to participate in the surveillance module, CODI must be selected in your monthly reporting plan. You can see the box with an arrow included here. UTI events can be reported manually or via CDA. And as a note, catheter-associated SUDIs and ABUDIs are CMS reportable, so keep that in mind. The NHSN application is comprised of 5 categories of information when working to enter a UTI event. This includes patient information, event information, risk factors, event details, and some information about pathogens. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time here talking about risk factors. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this field within the application if you've been conducting UTI surveillance for quite some time. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the urinary catheter field. So when entering a UTI event, it is required, and the options include in place, remove, or neither. If you report in place, that's indicative of the fact that a urinary catheter was in place for more than 2 consecutive days on the date of event. If you select remove, urinary catheter was in place for more than 2 consecutive days, but was removed the day before the date of event. And for neither, that would mean that a urinary catheter was not in place at all or was in place for less than 2 calendar days on the date of event. And we'll talk about it a little bit later here, but you may have noticed a new risk factor field starting January 2025, and we're going to get into that once we reach the What's New in the UTI Events module portion of this presentation. But before we get there, let's talk about collecting summary denominator data. This is what it looks like to manually collect. So you have a form here, and you'd be collecting information for all locations, and you would count at the same time each day. You would count the number of patients on the inpatient unit, the number of patients with an indwelling urinary catheter, and then you would report that to the NHSN application. So again, patient days and urinary catheter days should be reported monthly and by individual unit. You can see an example here to the right. If no UTI events occurred for a month, you would check the Report No Events box. And again, you must check that box for each unit or location you're conducting CODI surveillance for. I alluded to this section a little bit earlier, but let's talk about what's new in the UTI Events module. We added a neurogenic bladder definition to the protocol and a neurogenic bladder risk factor field to the application, and our objective in doing so is to assess the number of spinal cord injury patients with neurogenic bladder to explore if the current UTI event module may require modification. And for those of you that have reviewed the 2025 version of Chapter 7, this definition may look familiar, but let's go ahead and review it together. So, NHSN defines spinal cord injury associated neurogenic bladder, or SCINB, as a dysfunction or damage to the nerves that control the bladder as a result of a spinal cord injury. And in order to answer yes to the neurogenic bladder field within the NHSN application, you must utilize some ICD-10 diagnosis codes. You'll use one diagnosis code that is indicative of a diagnosis of spinal cord injury, and one that indicates a diagnosis of neurogenic bladder. And in tandem, these codes define SCINB for NHSN surveillance purposes, and we have a complete list of these codes on the NHSN webpage on the UTI events page under supporting materials. I have included a glimpse of those codes here for you today. Right now, we have 300 spinal cord injury codes and 5 neurogenic bladder codes. And currently, spinal cord injury is related to traumatic etiologies only. However, we will capture traumatic and non-traumatic etiology starting January 2026. And I've included a hyperlink here for those of you who are curious and have not seen this code list prior. This new risk factor field is optional for 2025 reporting as we're still in the exploratory phase. However, we do urge NHSN users to log in and use this field, getting familiar with the code list and how it operates within the application. However, please note that it is not currently an exclusion, and it does not have an impact on CODI determinations or NHSN analytics. Chapter 7 definitions should be applied as they are currently written, and CODI events that are related to SCI-NB should still be reported as done previously. And if an SCI-NB diagnostic code is documented in the patient's medical record and it must align with the NHSN provided list, then it is eligible for use. Okay, give everybody a minute here to reorient, think about all the information we've covered today as we are going to jump into some of the UTI case studies. I do have 7 case studies. There may not be time to get through all of them, but you will have a little bit of homework that you can take back and practice if we don't. But before we get started with the case studies, I created this slide that kind of go through the different steps that I at least think are helpful when investigating a positive urine culture. I understand that some folks, kind of have their own, kind of rhythm as they go through these things, and this isn't meant to be prescriptive, but just to kind of give us some general guidance as we go through the case studies here today. This also mirrors the handout that exists in the annual training community within ServiceNow. We worked with somebody to make it look a little bit nicer, so that one I would take a look at versus this slide and follow along as we go through some of the case studies. But the first step when investigating a positive urine culture is to assess the eligibility of that positive urine culture. So we want to know, is it at the right CFU count? And are there no more than 2 organisms identified? And is that organism that's identified eligible for use? And you would figure that out by using the NHSN terminology browser. We would then move on to setting a 7-day infection window period, or IWP. Once that's established, you would look to find the first element within that time frame, and that is used to meet site-specific criterion. So for UTI criteria, if there is, then you'd have a UTI event, and if not, there's no event to report, because again, a urine culture alone does not equate to UTI event. So let's keep that in mind. Once you've located the first elements within the IWP, you'd look to set the date of event. You would then move on to establish if it is a present on admission or healthcare-associated infection. And as a reminder, something that's present on admission is if you find the date of event to be the 2 days before admission or the calendar day after, and it is considered healthcare associated if it is found to be on hospital day 3 or later. Next, you'd look to associate catheter use to the UTI event, and lastly, you'd set the RIT and SBAP. So let's go ahead and jump into some of these case studies. Case study 1. Give you, maybe 30 seconds, take a quick glance through the details here on the right side and let me know if you think this patient has a UTI. And we've got some thorough rationale, so we'll work through it together. There's no judgment here. It's a safe place, so feel free to give us your best guess and we'll be sure to correct anything that may be confusing later.
A lot of A's coming in.
Lots of A's. Okay. All right. Well, it just happens that A is the correct answer. So congratulations, everybody. But let's explain why. So on 7/13, a patient was admitted from a long-term care facility for a diabetic foot ulcer and difficulty ambulating. The patient had a Foley catheter present and a urine culture was collected. And here's the result here. It is eligible for use. It sets an IWP, but I will note that it is shortened because just as a general rule of thumb, infection window periods cannot extend past that POA timeframe, which are the 2 days before an inpatient admission. So this IWP is not exactly 7 days. However, there was no eligible UTI sign or symptom reported within the IWP. And as we know, a positive urine culture alone is not enough to be a UTI event, and so no RIT or SBAP is set. However, that's not the end of the story, is it? So we'll move on to the next. So we have another urine culture collected on 7/20. We find E. coli this time. It's at that proper CFU threshold, and it does set an infection window period spanning from 7/17 to 7/23. We then look to see what sign or symptom falls within that time frame as we want to set the date of event. And what we find is that there is a fever reported that's greater than 38 degrees Celsius or 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, which makes it eligible for use. And it is that first element captured within the IWP, setting the date of event as 7/18. Since the date of event was found to be on hospital day 6, as we just discussed, anything that occurs on hospital day 3 or later is a healthcare associated infection. And since this patient had an IUC in place for greater than 2 consecutive days in an inpatient location on the date of event, this is a CODI meeting SUDI 1A criterion. The RIT is set, which is 7/18 to 7/31, and the SBAP is also set, as both of those always follow a UTI event, and that's going to be 7/17 to 7/31. If there's any questions related to case study 1 or any confusions, again, please use that Q&A feature or submit a question in the AT community, and we'll be sure to provide some clarification there. But I think that most everybody answered A, so we're rocking it. Next up here is case study 2. Similarly, I'll give you some time to review and then let me know if you think this patient has a UTI event.
Saying lots of A's. Excuse me. G.
G. Okay, I was worried for a minute there. The answer is G. So nice work, everybody. The answer is G, but let's talk about why. So there is a patient admitted to an inpatient unit on 2/10. They have a Foley catheter placed and a urine culture is collected. The urine culture result is 75,000 to 100,000 CFU per ml of Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which is an eligible organism. You can check the terminology browser to fact check me there, but I promise you it's an eligible one. However, because of the range could not be clarified by the laboratorian, we're not exactly sure where it falls between 75 and 100,000 CFU, and so it is not eligible for use, meaning there's no UTI event to report, no RIT or SBAP to set, and if you, again, need any clarification around, confirming where in the range a pathogen lies, we do have UTI question 2 in the FAQ. So nice work, everybody. We got that one right. I think we're 2 for 2 so far. We do have 7 case studies here today, so we'll see if we can make it through all of them. But I'll let you review the details of case study 3 here, and similarly, let us know what you're thinking in the chat.
Slowly but surely they're coming in.
Okay, yeah, we can give folks a little bit more time. Take a look at all the information here.
B, G.
Okay, B, G, kind of teetering between the two. Okay. Well, I can clarify. So the answer here is B. This is a SUDI 1B or a non-catheter associated event. Let's talk about it. So on 9/8, patient reports new onset of both urinary urgency and frequency, and a urine culture is collected. And the results are as follows. So the result for Staphylococcus aureus was 50,000 to 100,000 CFU per ml. And for Enterococcus avium, the CFU threshold was found to be greater than 100,000. So it is eligible for use there. So an IWP is set of 9/5 to 9/11, but it is important to note because Staphylococcus aureus was reported as that range, and it could not be clarified if it was equal to or greater than 100,000 CFU per ml, it does not get reported to NHSN. You would only report Enterococcus avium for this particular event. But now that we've set an IWP, we want to see if there are any signs or symptoms that fall within that as we want to set the date of event, right? So the report of urinary urgency and urinary frequency are eligible for use, and they also happen to be those first elements captured within the IWP, and the date of event is found to be 9/8. We would then look to see if this is a POA or HAI event. And because the date of event occurred on hospital day 4, it is a healthcare associated infection. Since the patient did not have an IUC in place for greater than 2 consecutive days in an inpatient location on the date of event, this is a non-CODI, meeting SUDI 1B criterion. The RIT and SBAP are set. And that is a wrap on case study 3.
Yep.
All right, we're moving through these pretty quickly, so nice work, everybody. I'm going to take a drink of water as you review this next one and take some extra time. You can see here that we have a new column of information related to location, which is going to make this a little bit trickier. So really take a moment, feel free to draw some things out if that's helpful, and then we'll jump into the correct answer. But in the meantime, feel free to add your answer to the chat, and we'll reconnect here in just a little bit.
About 15 minutes. A's coming through.
Looks like
Lots
lots of aids.
Okay, that's great news. Great news. We'll give folks maybe 10 more seconds just because this was a little bit harder. Do there happen to be any B's?
Mostly A's. 1B. I did see 1B.
Okay, so this one is tricky. It actually
And an E.
And an E. Okay, we're spicing it up here for case study 4. So A is the correct answer, but this is also a SUDI 1B event. So for those of you who are familiar with chapter 2, it is possible for a diagnostic test to account for both an HAI and a POA event. And you can see that the patient spent some time in locations A, a little time in the ED, and locations B. So let's talk about how all of these things kind of play together. So in typical fashion, as I think we've gotten used to at this point, we're going to start with that urine culture, right? So we're going to look to the urine culture that was collected on 8/18. It also happened to be the same date that the patient was admitted to an inpatient location. And you can see that the culture results are as follows: 100,000 CFU per ml of Klebsiella pneumoniae and a greater than 100,000 CFU per ml of Enterococcus faecalis, both of which meet that proper CFU threshold, are eligible organisms and would ultimately make their way into the NHSN application. And another note here is that this is an eligible urine culture, so it in turn sets an IWP. But similarly to one of our prior case studies, the IWP is shortened just a little bit as it can extend past that POA timeframe, which as a reminder is 2 days before inpatient admission. So on 8/16, the patient spent some time in the ED. They reported pelvic pain and leakage around the Foley site, and suprapubic tenderness was also documented. And the report of suprapubic tenderness is within that POA timeframe, and it's eligible for use. Again, for those who are not familiar, this is detailed out in chapter 2. But any reported signs or symptoms or test results that occur within the POA timeframe and are documented in the patient's final medical record are eligible for use. So the report of suprapubic tenderness, again, within that POA timeframe is eligible for use. And it also happens to be the first element captured within the infection window period, setting the date of event as 8/16. However, since the event occurred on the day after discharge, that's when the transfer rule comes into play, right? And so the transfer rule is applied, and the infection is attributed to that discharging location, location A. So for location A, the date of event occurred after hospital day 3, making this a healthcare-associated infection. Since the patient had an IUC in place for greater than 2 consecutive days in an inpatient location, location A, on the date of event, this is a CODI meeting SUDI 1A criterion, and both an RIT and RIT are set. Both an RIT and SBAP are set. However, the RIT does not carry over from one admission to another, so this one would ultimately end and does not cross into anything that we're going to be doing with location B. And I'll also note this is detailed in Chapter 2, but it is important for facilities to always share information of potential HAI events that occur before and following transfers between facilities, just to make sure that everybody's kind of in the know when it comes to HAI events. But let's talk about location B a little bit. So within location B, we find that that date of event that is housed within the IWP occurs before hospital day 3, making this a present on admission or POA infection. And since the patient did not have an IUC in place for greater than 2 consecutive days in an inpatient location on the date of event, this is a non-CODI or SUDI 1B. And a present on admission RIT is set for that second admission. So again, to clarify, while an RIT was set for location A, it does not extend into a new admission, but a new RIT is set for the second admission to location B, and it is going to be for that present on admission event. It spans from 8/18 to 8/31. And since the dates here maybe don't exactly align, let me explain a little bit. So the date of event happened to occur 2 days prior to admission to location B. And so this is clarified further in Chapter 2. But in a situation like this, you would use the date of admission to location B to mark day 1 of the RIT. So there's a lot of moving parts going on in this particular case study. And again, if you have any questions or sticking points, please use that Q&A function or send us a message in the AT community, and I'd be happy to answer it after this training. Another important note is that only NHSN SUDI 1A/CODI events are required to be reported by CMS. However, it's really important to check your state and local requirements as they can vary from state to state. So be sure to know which jurisdiction you're operating in and what the expectation is around reporting. The answer was A and B for that one. So we're moving on here to case study 5, which I think will be our last one here today. So I'll leave you with case studies 6 and 7 for homework, but take some time, review the information here, and then we'll discuss the answer.
No responses yet.
Okay. There's some information to tease through here, so we'll let them take a look.
Getting D's and G's.
Okay, D's and G's. We looking like a 50-50 split, or are we leaning one way more than the other?
More D's now.
Okay, that's good news, because the answer is D. So yes, it's a SUDI 2 non-catheter associated event. We're going to walk through the information here. So on 12/18, a urine culture is collected. It is at that proper CFU threshold, and Pseudomonas aeruginosa, as I mentioned before, is an eligible organism. In turn, this does set an infection window period of 12/15 to 12/21. We would then look to see what element kind of falls first within that time frame, and it happens to be the report of hypothermia. So the measured temperature is eligible for use as it's less than 36 degrees Celsius or 96.8 degrees Fahrenheit. And it also happens to set the date of event. So 12/15 is the date of event. And something important to note here, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but fever and hypothermia are non-specific symptoms of infection. And because of that, they cannot be excluded from a UTI determination because they are deemed to another recognized cause. So that other recognized cause, be sure to check the protocol, but fever and hypothermia are not one of those that are eligible for exclusion. Since the date of event is found to be on hospital day 3, this is a healthcare associated infection. And since the patient is less than 1 year of age and did not have an IUC in place for greater than 2 consecutive days in an inpatient location on the date of event, this is the non-CODI, meaning SUDI 2 criterion, and per typical fashion, an RIT and ASPEP are both set. Okay. I think I got muted here for a second, but yeah, everybody close your eyes really quick. I'm going to go through case study 6, case study 7. Please don't peek at the answers because this is your homework. So we're going to scroll really quickly through here. If I find anyone cheating, I'm going to be upset. Okay, so please review those later because they are great examples of what to do when looking to identify a UTI event. And I'll wrap by just showing you some additional resources that you may find useful as you work to conduct UTI surveillance. We again have those FAQs, red sirens, gold stars. Again, please make sure that this is highlighted as you're going through your event determinations. Please review those FAQs, the terminology browser, our patient safety component manual, which chapters 2, 7, and 16 are going to be really helpful for you. And then we also have some HAI POA determination tools, which are linked here below. But I just want to thank everybody